they didn't find much. But on an island off Alaska, they were able to get 6 of the 8 segments of the RNA virus. And then they went back to Fort Detrick, Maryland, because the way in which it got to this country was, it was the end of World War I. And all the troops over there got it. And when they came back to the United States, they spread it all over the United States. But anyone that was sick, they took blood samples, put them between 2 slides, smeared them between 2 slides, and left them sealed like that, and they had tens of thousands of blood samples at Fort Detrick. So the CDC went in there and probed those and found the other segments, and they have put this virus back together at the CDC in Atlanta and are doing experiments on it to see if they can figure out what about it kills so many people. So it is interesting how they found, how they put the virus back together, and to know that they now have it intact. So they are working on it. What else do I want? The vaccine. When every year, every country has a different vaccine. Each country in the world that has a national health service of some sort will select a person and an agency that will do computer projections on, you know, air travel, boat travel, train travel, and try to figure out what strains will hit their country. They do computer projections to try to figure out and predict, because remember, there are hundreds of strains, and they have to predict what 3 will hit the United States. When they do that, then they get samples and make a preliminary vaccine, and then they have to send it to Canada or France or England to make the vaccine, because U.S. drug companies refuse to make the flu vaccine. They won't make the flu vaccine, the killed one that most people get, the shot. They won't make it because they went to Congress and said, we want immunity from anyone having a bad reaction from the flu vaccine. If you're going to give everyone in the population, there's going to be a, you know, it's 1 out of every 5 million that has a bad reaction. And we want immunity, and Congress said no, and so they said, well, then we won't make it here. So when there is an outbreak of a dangerous flu, remember, we have to depend on Canada or England or France to supply us. And you think that Canada is going to supply us before they supply Canadians? So it is kind of tricky about the flu vaccine, because you have to guess 9 months before flu season what strains are going to hit here. And then those strains have to grow good in eggs. They grow them in hens' eggs, fertilized hens' eggs. And then they have to make it in huge quantities, so, you know, 50 million doses. So flu is tricky. Now, what's so amazing about flu is 40,000 people a year die from complications of the flu. It's a $20 shot, and most people don't get it. It's insane. You get hysterical when 490 people die of AIDS, and yet 40,000 die of the influenza, and you have a vaccine, and you won't go get it. Now, why don't people get the flu vaccine? One, they heard it doesn't work. It does work, but if the woman that's at CDC that decides, guesses wrong, and puts the wrong 3 strains, you'll get the vaccine and it won't work. That's just chance. 2, all these wives' tales that people tell each other, the old urban legends. Well, I went and got that flu vaccine, and I got the flu from the vaccine. Bullshit. You did not. It's killed, it's tested, and it is killed. What happened? You're a little nuts, awful person. You waited until everybody around you was sick. Then you go, oh God, this must be serious. So you went and got the vaccine after you were exposed. Remember, if you get the vaccine, it takes 2 months to get protection. So you cannot be exposed to it before you get it, or during the 2 months before the antibodies are made. That's why they start giving the vaccine in August for November. So if you wait and get the vaccine late, you have already been exposed. You're in that 2-week prodrome period when you haven't just got it yet. The vaccine's not going to do a thing for you. So remember, you have to get it 60 to 90 days before you're ever come in contact with anyone that's got it. And then it has to be the right one. Now, why get it every year? Because every year you're getting a separate 3 different strains. So if she misses it at CDC, probably in the last 5 years, you've gotten that strain vaccine, so you are partially or completely protected. Every year you're banking up a huge reservoir of protection of all the historical strains. So if you get it every year, then you have gotten the historical background, and you'll probably, that's why people, when they had H1N1, people got the 1951 flu vaccine. It was related to the H1N1 that was wiping out people. And they got either a mild form or didn't get it at all. And then the next year, H1N1 was in our vaccine. So nobody will get it now. So they're worrying about the new one. It's out now. So remember, and what about the antiviral treatments? Don't even think about it. They're crap. You know, Theraflu and all of these other things, they're only reserved for medical people and nurses and doctors where there is no vaccine, because they're very expensive. You have to take it for 3 months before you're exposed and the entire time that the epidemic is in place. And so the antiviral drugs are just not good. You know, people aren't that consistent in taking drugs to prevent something like this. And it's very expensive, and here we've even found that it mutates so rapidly that the antiviral that everybody was selling for H1N1 doesn't actually work anymore. And then there's a couple of them that are only for A, and a couple of them that are only for B, and you would have to take 2. So anyway, now they have recombinant flu mist that you can take as a aerosol in your nose or drops, and those are better. They're attenuated. What's better about a live attenuated vaccine? Attenuated is that one that's been put to an unnatural host for several generations and it can no longer cause infection. But if it's live, that means it's living inside you, constantly giving you immunity. Your body's responding to it every day, making antibodies. So it's a very high level of protection that is constant. That's why a live vaccine is better than a dead one. A dead one is killed, and eventually the immunity wears off. You need a booster. Live, you don't. These are all the different antiviral treatments. Just remember, they either don't work well, they've become, viruses become immune to them, or people don't take them consistently enough. All right, so last topic in this chapter is interferon, and we've already talked about it. A very small protein produced by mammalian cells when they're infected by a virus is released and protects nearby cells of the same cell type from that particular virus. That's called interferon. And at one time we thought it was the answer to all viral infections, just like antibiotics were the answer to bacterial infections. And then we discovered that it was really small and hard to make and cost hundreds of thousands. And then they made it recombinantly, and they had plenty, and they discovered the side effects are horrible. And for every different tissue, you need a different interferon. So the use of interferon is basically stopgap or last measure for viral treatment when we have nothing else. The side effects are so horrible. Most people that take it would rather die than get the injections every day. They basically give you a little vial of it and a syringe, some sterile syringes, and you keep it in your refrigerator and you inject yourself intramuscularly every day.
Where are they getting it from?
Prescription.
No.
Oh, they make it recombinant.
In sheep or?
Yeah. Okay, so that's the end of this chapter, and that gives us about 30 minutes to get started on the next one. And that's HIV/AIDS. And let me see if I can pull that up here. Anyone have any questions on anything yet? Okay, so we're going to start with the HIV/AIDS, and some of this you're going to be responsible for what's on the PowerPoint. I'm not going to be able to give you as much history as I usually do. I'm going to have to sort of shorten it to give you an idea of what's going on. But didn't we talk about Michael Gottlieb discovering it the other day? Or did we? All right, let's just talk about when it first came into being. This virus had puttered along and not been apparent throughout the world for a long time, but it was originally a virus. It's called a human immunodeficiency virus, but it was originally simian immunodeficiency virus. Now, every animal we've ever investigated at length, we have found an immunodeficiency virus. What's AIDS in cats called? Feline leukemia virus, FLV. That's AIDS in cats. And by the way, it's transmitted sexually and by biting blood fighting. In other words, they bite each other and the blood from one gets into the other, and that's how. And it kills adult cats and particularly kills babies, kittens. So every animal has an immunodeficiency virus. And this one was originally of simians, which is monkeys, and the particular one that we got was from a subspecies of chimpanzee found in Cameroon. What happened was, it's a zoonosis, and people were hungry, and they went out into the forest just like we did when we first came to this country. What did? We went hunting for food and killed a deer in the local. And so that's what they were doing, and in the process of chopping up and cutting up the animal for food, people that had cuts or breaks in their hand, the virus got into a similar host cell. Well, we have very similar white cells to monkeys, and it got into us, but that's no problem really except for that person. Because what would happen? That virus would be in that hunter, and he might take it and give it to his wife, and she might give it to her child, but that would be limited. It wouldn't spread all over everybody, because you're not having sex with everybody in your village. And you're not, doing anything that was transmitted. And so it jumped into man in small numbers, in villages, in Central Africa, before 1900, because we have some reports of the same symptoms and people died. And then we know it jumped in the 1940s, because a guy in the 1950s died, got sick, was sent to England. They couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. They froze his tissues back and he died, and later on, once we had it, we went and looked at those tissues and he was infected with it. But it jumped in the 40s into people, and then it jumped in the 60s into people, but in the 60s we had introduced poorly equipped hospitals, blood transfusion, and there was a lot of prostitution and selling of sex. And so it spread all over Africa. And then because there was an immigration, we'll talk about it, not from Africa to the United States, but actually what happened was, I'll just kind of jump forward and show you what happened. This is what happened to poor Africa. I mean, Africa and Asia have really been kind of totally mistreated by the rest of the world, because after World War I and then after World War II, these areas of the world that the Europeans were more powerful, could push people around, decided to Christianize and civilize. And which is kind of funny, since there was a civilizations in Africa and in China while we were rubbing sticks together. You know, the first civilization was in Africa, and there were large civilizations in Africa. And China, was weaving silk when we were still in caves. So the idea that Europeans are going to go to these areas and civilize them is ludicrous, but anyway, you know, this was that white man's burden idea. And so what happened in 1910, from 1885 to 1910, was the Europeans divided up Africa and Asia into spheres of influence of the colonial powers. And their job was to go in there and transfer our civilized society and democracy and Christianity to these heathens. And the colors represent the spheres of influence of the different countries. Light green is France, pink is England, blue is the Belgians, dark green is Portugal, brown is Germany, red is Italy, yellow were the two independent countries, Liberia and Ethiopia. So Africa was divided up into spheres of influence, and when the Europeans went in there, they controlled the population. In other words, everybody had identity cards, and the Europeans were in charge of the administration, the police, the civil law, and all of that, and people had to have permission to move from one place to another. I lived under a dictatorship at one time in Brazil, and we all had to have identity papers signed by the local police, and if you were under 21, you had to have permission to leave the city limits. And if the police caught you, you were automatically beaten up a good bit and sent to jail. I know because I stole my daddy's car when I was 17, when he was away on vacation, and I drove it to a nearby city and was stopped by the military police. And the military police are scary because they don't have police cars that go, they just stand on the side of the road with a machine gun. And if they don't like the way you look, they point right at you and they go, pull over. And if you don't, and it was scary as hell. And they pulled me over, they asked for my documents and permissions, and I didn't have it. They called a tow company, seized my father's car, and took me to jail. And so these are the types of controls that a totalitarian or control organization will do to keep people under control. One day my dad woke up and he had a research farm, and on the front lawn of his research farm there was a dead body. And so we went out, we looked, the man's dead. We called the police and they said, we have a dead body on our front lawn. And they said, what's your address? We gave them the address and they said, no you don't. We said, yes we do. We said, no you don't. We'll be over. You don't have a dead body. There is nothing on your front lawn. Shut up. This was Esquadrão de Morte, and this was the military rulers. Anybody that rebelled was called a terrorist, and they disposed of them in the night and left their bodies wherever, and people didn't ask questions, because if you asked questions, suddenly you would disappear. Remember, they disappeared hundreds of people in Argentina and Brazil during the dictatorships. So this was kind of like what was going on in these countries. The European powers were sucking out the gold and resources and diamonds and everything. And Belgian Congo, it was mostly copper. And who did the work? The native people did. Now, did they train the local people as engineers to do this and run the equipment? No, they didn't. They were to dig. The Europeans ran the corporations and were the engineers and the doctors and everything. And they kept people under control. Some countries much worse than others. For instance, the Portuguese are weird. I mean, they're kind of strange. They're not like the British. The British were like, I'm sorry, we're white, you're not. And there's going to be a big separation. And there's only black and white, so you're not us, so that's it. Now the Portuguese, if you're pretty, I don't care what color you are, I'll marry you. And so that kind of thing. And the French were that way too, so they didn't keep as tight a control over their populations. They intermarried with them more than the British or the Belgians. And so anyway, when they went in there, they drew the borders not where people live, but where there are rivers and so forth. And so you have this very bizarre shape of the Belgian Congo. And if you look at nation groups, what's the definition of a nation? A group of people that have a common history, a common heritage, usually a common language, and usually a common religion. All right? So if you look at the nation groups in this one country, you'll see that most of the nation groups, actually the majority of that group, live outside the country. The most famous being the Hutu and the Tutsis. They live outside, but they are part of Eastern Congo. And so they have always hated each other. If you remember the genocide in Burundi and Rwanda. All right, here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 nation groups. None of which, except for 5, are completely within the borders of the Congo. So, they have parliamentary form of government, and every nation group has at least 2 political parties. So here we have 14 political parties running for elections. So, here's what happens. This group makes a deal with this group, and they win the election, and they appoint the prime minister. But this group decides they're getting a raw deal because these guys offer them a better one. So they pull out of the government, and the government falls. They have to have new elections. So they have election after election after election. The alliances are constantly shifting, which means constant civil war. So, that is why all over Africa, except for these incredibly small countries that can't even support themselves because they're so small, they have these diverse competing groups that will always be in civil war. Now, the solution for this is to redraw the borders. Do you think that's going to work? You see, if you allow the redrawing of borders, did you know that more Armenians live outside of Armenia than in Armenia? There are a major population in Turkey, there are a major population in Iran, and there are more Armenians in Glendale than in the capital of Armenia. No, it's true, because they left during the diaspora after the Turkish genocide and all that. So, there are more Hungarians that live outside of Hungary than in Hungary. There are more Germans that live outside of Germany than in Germany. So if they redraw the borders according to where Germans live, Russia would have to give up some land, and so would Poland, and so forth, and Czechoslovakia, and so forth. And so if they allowed the redrawing of borders, almost every country in the world would have altered borders. And no country is going to give up land to another one. So we would have world war instead of just civil war. So on the day after the fall of the Soviet Union, the United Nations declared all borders that existed the day before the fall of the Soviet Union are permanent forever. And they declared that no 2 countries could come together and form a third, or part of another one could become independent unless there was no violence and they both voted. So that's why Kosovo will never be recognized by the United Nations as an independent country, because they had this horrible civil war about it. And so you have this, it's perpetuated forever that this is going to be chaos. And why am I bringing it up? Because that's why HIV/AIDS spread all over these countries and nobody noticed. They were in political chaos already. They were already in civil war. So how do you know people are losing weight and wasting to nothing because they've got a new disease versus they can't plant their crops and they're starving to death? You can't tell. And that's why it was not noticed that this disease was spreading in huge numbers in the population. because there was already chaos and civil war. Now what happened to the Belgian Congo was the Belgian people were very harsh to the Congolese. And in the 60s, the Congolese said, hold it, we're the richest country in the world. We have more gold, more copper, more bauxite, more diamonds than any other country in the world. Yet, we're the poorest. And they're not educating us, they're not putting resources back in here. So, we're going to rebel and ask to be an independent nation. So they started a guerrilla war against the Congo. Now what do you think, against the Belgians. So what do you think the Belgians did? What did we all do in the 60s and 70s when something we didn't like in our country was happening? What did we scream? What do we scream now? Terrorist! We don't like what somebody does, we call them terrorists. What did we call them then? Communists. Oh my God! The communists are going to take over the Central Africa and it's going to spread the domino theory. One country falls, then the next, and they'll all fall to communism. And so, the Belgians went to the United Nations and had a resolution passed condemning the revolution in the Congo and asked the United States to send troops to put down the communist rebellion in the Congo. Thank God we didn't have those big planes where we could fly thousands of troops over that we have now. Kennedy agreed with Belgium to go put down the revolution in the Congo. But, have you ever heard of the great Belgian warrior? Wonderful Belgian troops? There aren't any. They're like the French. We surrendered. And so by the time the Americans got ready to go help the Belgians, they'd already surrendered. So, what did the Belgians do once they surrendered to the Congolese revolutionaries? They took their toys and went home. So I actually went to Zaire and I saw where they pulled X-ray machines out of the walls of the hospital in Kinshasa. They said, okay, fine, you don't want us here? Great. We're going to take our generators, we're going to take the engines to our trains, we're going to take our X-ray equipment, and we're going home. So whatever we did to improve your lives, get over it. We're taking it back. So they went home, and they took all their stuff, and then when they got home, remember, the only export they had was copper. And they said to the rest of Europe and all their friends, excuse me, you're not buying copper from the Congo. If you buy copper from the Congo, you won't be doing business in Belgium anymore. And so suddenly, the whole world had to go to Chile to get their copper. They couldn't get it, and the economy, what was left, collapsed. And you can go back now in this area and see abandoned copper mines everywhere. They're not even on their feet yet because their markets dried up. All the people that knew how to run things went away, all the engineers and everything, and the Congolese were left with no market and no people to run things that knew what they were doing because they never were trained. So what happens if you have an almost industrial economy and suddenly it crashes? People start starving by the tens of thousands. They don't have seed to plant, they don't have fertilizer, they don't have a market to thing. There is constant chaos and civil war, and so people hear that in the big cities, the streets are paved with gold. You know how people talk. And so from the rural areas, prior to 1960, Africa was a rural continent. There were very few big cities, no mega cities. Then hundreds of thousands of people, after they became independent, moved to the big cities. If that little virus that jumped into these villages, if those people move to the big city, they get to the big city, what can they sell? There are only two things you can sell when you have nothing. Sex and blood. Sex and blood. And so, when they get by the hundreds of thousands from the rural areas, all it takes is one person donating blood, contaminating the blood supply that's then used for transfusions, and people, the grown-up man in the family goes to the big city to work and sends his money back to his family living in the woods, and he comes and visits his wife twice a year. You think he's not going to have hoochie while he's at home in the big city? Yeah, he's going to visit a prostitute, have some fun, and if he didn't have it, he's going to get it there and take it back to his village. If he had it in his village, he's going to donate blood and give it to the prostitute. So you have this virus that was bubbling around at a very low level, suddenly in huge amounts of people, and once it gets to a certain high level, it spreads everywhere. And in Africa, almost everything moves by truck. So truckers, what do you think they do? They drive all day long and half the night, and they stop at these little hotels that give you food, bed, and a little hoochie. And so you can actually plot the spread of HIV/AIDS, which started right here and right there, along trucking routes throughout Africa. So this disease spread unnoticed because of political and economic reasons. And then, guess what happened? Once they threw out the Belgians, what language do they speak primarily in Belgium? French. French and Flemish, but mostly French. Now, if you throw out all the doctors and engineers and lawyers and educated people, because that's what the Belgians left, and there was nobody to take over, and you speak French, are you going to ask France, who controls all of this, to be your new colonial master? You think? No, you need educated doctors and lawyers and engineers, which you're certainly not going to ask France. They already are a master next door. You just got rid of a master. What'd they do? They contracted with Haiti. And thousands of Haitians were contracted for a 10-year period in the Congo to be the doctors and nurses and lawyers and engineers, and to set up the universities and things like that. So, you think they didn't intermarry and have sex or get transfusions? And they took it back to Haiti, and it permeated the island there, and then what happened? The Haitian boat lived. Where all those tens of thousands of Haitians left Haiti because of Papa Doc and his dictatorship and came to South Florida. And so you can see in two different places in the United States, on the East Coast, HIV entering the country. The Haitian immigration and New York City ran out of blood. All of New England ran out of blood. In those days, they transfused blood like, you went to the hospital and got a hangnail, they give you a unit of blood. Quite that bad, but Nowadays, they hardly ever transfuse blood during any procedure. They try not to. In fact, when you're on the table, they actually take the blood that's pouring out of you and stick it back in you to keep from having to do it, because there are diseases that we don't know that are bloodborne, and we found out by this. But at that time, what they did was the American way. We low bid it. We said on the world market, we're out of plasma and blood products. We want to low bid it, so we bought huge amounts of blood from East Africa and the Philippines. Tested it for the known diseases, which was only syphilis and hepatitis B. It was negative. We didn't know this disease existed, and we massively transfused it in the United States. So HIV entered two directions. By the way, the most infected city outside of East Africa is New York City in the world. Has the highest positivity rate. The leading cause of death in people under 40 is AIDS in New York City. Miami also has an incredibly high rate. Now, what was going on in the United States? Pre-love, rebellion against the Vietnam War. You see, in the United States, at the very same time, two social events were causing a change for this virus to spread massively. One, after World War II, let's say before World War II, the average number of children in a family was 4.1. I don't know how you have a 0.1 child, but anyway, I bet some of you have a 0.1 child. But anyway, there were 4.1 children for every family in the United States. That was the average. After World War II, it was 2.2. Why? The men went away to war. And while they were at war, they were trained in the military to use condoms to keep from getting gonorrhea and syphilis. It also stops pregnancy. While they were away at war, who made the tanks and the guns and the airplanes? Women in the factories. So when the men got back from war, they said, "Bitch, I want you to get up tomorrow morning and make my breakfast. I want fried eggs and scrambled eggs and some ham and some sausage and homemade biscuits. And I got to be at work at 8, so we're going to have this at 6. And she said, things have changed, honey. We are not going to be doing it that way. We both have jobs now. And guess what? I'm not having 8 or 6 or 4 of your snotty-nosed little rats. We're having 2. We're going to control our reproduction through the condom and the diaphragm. We're going to have 2 kids. We're going to buy a house, have a new car, and go on vacation like rich people. We're not going to have all these kids. We're going to have to limit our population. And by the way, we're having cereal and juice and toast for breakfast. And I'm going to school and going to work, and the kids are going to school, and you're going to be helping out. And so there was a social revolution in the United States of limiting our population after World War II because the men already knew how to use condoms, and they came back and they made an agreement to keep the number of kids down so they could enjoy the benefits of an industrialized society. And then the major change, 1961, the introduction of the birth control pill. This was a disaster. You see, prior to the birth control pill, if a girl got pregnant, whose fault was it? Not hers. It was his. Her daddy went to visit your daddy with a shotgun, and you married her. Or she went away to visit her great aunt for 9 months to a year and came back with a sister. And that was that. But when the birth control pill came out, men abdicated their responsibilities. Hey, I thought she was on the pill. Not my problem. It's her baby. Not mine. And remember, the pill, does it protect against sexually transmitted diseases? Not at all. Modern girls didn't use condoms. They're disgusting. That's what our parents use. Modern girls use the pill. Okay, so that's a major revolution, but that still wouldn't have been a problem except for the Vietnam War. Vietnam War came along and we instituted the draft in huge numbers. We had the draft, but we started using it. I'll never forget, on January the 19th, 1970, I sat in the lobby of the dorm at Auburn, holding hands with hundreds of other guys and girls, watching a little tiny television where Secretary of Defense McNamara pulled birth dates out of a drum like we do for the lotto. And the first 127 were drafted immediately to go to Vietnam. It didn't matter if you were going to college. You were drafted. And at 18, you could go fight a war and die in some place you didn't care about because of the domino theory that if Vietnam fell, all of Southeast Asia would fall to communism. You couldn't vote. You couldn't drink a beer. You couldn't sign a contract to buy a car, but you could die. And it pissed off American youth, and they rejected all of their parents' values. No more wait to get married, having sex. You're not going to live 5 years from now. You better have fun while you can. Make love, not war. And so the sexual revolution began because, remember, what were the bad consequences for having sex with as many people as you wanted? Getting pregnant, taken care of by the birth control pill. Getting syphilis, taken care of by penicillin. getting gonorrhea, taken care of by penicillin. That's all we knew was transmitted by sex. All three of those negative effects of having sex with whoever you wanted, whenever you wanted, as many times as you wanted, were alleviated. So people moved into communes and all of that. It was amazing. There's a commune across the street from me right now. Right? I can't believe still in California we have a commune. 3 guys and 5 women live together, and nobody knows whose children they are. There's 5 kids over there. Nobody knows exactly who the father is of all of them because they just get in big piles still. Except they had a falling out, so all the men are thrown out. I see them come and visit on alternate Sundays to visit the kids. But they don't even know who's whose unless they did a DNA. But anyway, here's some amazing things. The average heterosexual had between 25 and 50 sexual partners before they got married. This is even worse. 15% of all married people were swingers. Everybody know what swingers are?
Yeah.
That's when married couples meet other married couples and have a party and exchange partners. When I first came to LA City College, and you walk through that little breezeway there was a free magazine rack, and in it they had swingers magazines where they list up to 200 couples that wanted other couples to come and have parties and have sex with. 15% of all married couples were swingers. This one will really get you. Average homosexual had 5,000 sexual partners in a lifetime. Different ones. In the other class, they were all twisted. They want to know how that happened. Just to let you know, right over there, 2 blocks from here, is a gay bathhouse on the corner of the 101 and Melrose. And it's called Flex. And if you go 4 miles in that direction, there's a straight bathhouse. And bathhouses are where you go and pay $25 or $35 and they give you a locker and a towel. And you go in and you take your clothes off and you wrap up in the towel, you go take a shower, you get nice and clean and fresh, and then you walk around and sit in the little couches or go to the pool, the nude pool or the nude hot tub or the nude sauna room, and you meet people that you think are cute and you take them back to a little room and have sex with them. And they have gay ones and they have straight ones. In LA they have 12 gay ones and 5 straight ones. And you see what was going on then was most homosexuals would go to the bathhouses 3 times a week, and each time they would have sex with about 4 people. So during the week they had sex with 12 different people. On the weekend they had another 10. That's 22 a week times 52 weeks in a year. And you can see we're talking about some severe numbers. So here's what's happening. A horrible confluence of the actual perfect storm in a health disaster. We are bringing in huge amounts of contaminated blood and transfusing it in a population that is highly sexually active. And we began using IV drugs. IV drugs with shared needles. It was, when I was in college, they had shooting galleries. And you would go to a house and have a party, and someone would drag out the IV drugs, and everybody would throw in a hat and buy some, and they would have a set of works, a syringe, a glass syringe, and they would open it up and they hand out the rubber tubing, and people would mix it up and they would fill the syringe, get the air out, inject it, and then refill the syringe with their own blood to get all the drug out and into them, re-inject it, pull it out, and hand it to the next person. And it was considered rude and insulting to reject the needle shared by the, I mean, if you shot up, it was considered rude to accept, to refuse and say, oh, I want a sterile needle and a sterile syringe. So they were sharing needles for recreation, huge amounts of sex going on, a importing of blood that was untested introduced a new virus into a population that dropped the barrier condom and increased huge amounts. Plus, all of this is also coming in the Haitian boat people. And they are donating blood and getting it into it. So the only country in the world where HIV did not spread along the highways is the United States. It spread on only one highway, the I-95 corridor. You can plot the spread of HIV/AIDS. And then it spread to the major hubs, airline hubs. So you can plot the spread of HIV in the United States by air travel. And the funniest thing is, there was one little spot in the United States that was not highly infected all the way up until 1986, and that was San Diego. Everywhere else, it was pretty well spread out, but in San Diego, for some reason, there wasn't a huge amount. And the first few cases they can trace back to what we call patient zero. Patient zero was an airline steward on Air Canada from Quebec. And he used to go to the bathhouses. He was an incredibly handsome guy. And he was bisexual, so he had both sex with men and women. And he would go to the bathhouses and pick people up and take them to the room, but he would insist that they have sex with the lights out. And then at the end, he would flip on the lights and he would show them the purple lesions of Kaposi sarcoma and say, I have the gay cancer and now so do you. And they can trace the first 400 people back to one person, patient zero. And, you know, if you look at this movie and the band played on, they interviewed him and they talk about his name was Gaëtan Dugas. They actually did a screenplay and a book about him calling him Patient Zero. And at the time, they could do nothing. They could just say, hey, listen, you have this and it's sexually transmitted and we know it, but we can't prove it yet. And he said, you can't prove it, then I'm not going to change my behavior. Someone gave it to me and I'm willing to share. So it's just amazing how this thing spread all over the United States. So that's kind of a history of the disease spreading and how it got here and how it spread over Africa. Next time we're going to talk about finding the virus. Okay, go home. Would you hit that off for me today?
This one, right?
This country in the world that has a national health service of some sort will select a person and an agency that will do computer projections on, you know, air travel, boat travel, train travel, and try to figure out what strains will hit their country. They do computer projections to try to figure out and predict, because remember, there are hundreds of strains, and they have to predict what 3 will hit the United States. When they do that, then they get samples and make a preliminary vaccine, and then they have to send it to Canada or France or England to make the vaccine, because U.S. drug companies refuse to make the flu vaccine. They won't make the flu vaccine, the killed one that most people get, the shot. They won't make it because they went to Congress and said, we want immunity from anyone having a bad reaction from the flu vaccine. If you're going to give everyone in the population, there's going to be a, you know, it's 1 out of every 5 million that has a bad reaction. And we want immunity, and Congress said no, and so they said, well, then we won't make it here. So when there is an outbreak of a dangerous flu, I get it every year, because every year you're getting a separate 3 different strains. So if she misses it at CDC, probably in the last 5 years, you've gotten that strain vaccine, so you are partially or completely protected. Every year you're banking up a huge reservoir of protection of all the historical strains. So if you get it every year, then you have gotten the historical background, and you'll probably, that's why people, when they had H1N1, people got the 1951 flu vaccine. It was related to the H1N1 that was wiping out people. And they got either a mild form or didn't get it at all. And then the next year, H1N1 was in our vaccine. So nobody will get it now. So they're worrying about the new one. It's out now. So remember, and what about the antiviral treatments? Don't even think about it. They're crap. You know, Theraflu and all of these other things, they're only reserved for medical people and nurses and doctors where there is no vaccine, because they're very expensive. You have to take it for 3 months before you're exposed, and the entire time that, remember, we have to depend on Canada or England or France to supply us. And you think that Canada's going to supply us before they supply Canadians? So it is kind of tricky about the flu vaccine, because you have to guess 9 months before flu season what strains are going to hit here. And then those strains have to grow good in eggs. They grow them in hens' eggs, fertilized hens' eggs. And then they have to make it in huge quantities, so, 50 million doses. So flu is tricky. Now, what's so amazing about flu is 40,000 people a year die from complications of the flu. It's a $20 shot, and most people don't get it. It's insane. You get hysterical when 490 people die of AIDS, and yet 40,000 die of the influenza, and you have a vaccine, and you won't go get it. Now, why don't people get the flu vaccine? One, they heard it doesn't work. It does work, but if the woman that's at CDC that decides, guesses wrong, and puts her on, they didn't find much. But on an island off Alaska, they were able to get 6 of the 8 segments of the RNA virus. And then they went back to Fort Detrick, Maryland, because the way in which it got to this country was, it was the end of World War I. And all the troops over there got it. And when they came back to the United States, they spread it all over the United States. But anyone that was sick, they took blood samples, put them between 2 slides, smeared them between 2 slides, and left them sealed like that, and they had tens of thousands of blood samples at Fort Detrick. So the CDC went in there and probed those and found the other segments, and they have put this virus back together at the CDC in Atlanta, and are doing experiments on it to see if they can figure out what about it kills so many people. So it is interesting how they found, how they put the virus back together, and to know that they now have it intact. So they are working on it. What else do I want? The vaccine. When every year, every country has a different vaccine. Each among 3 strains, you'll get the vaccine and it won't work. That's just chance. 2, all these wives' tales that people tell each other, the old urban legends. Well, I went and got that flu vaccine, and I got the flu from the vaccine. Bullshit. You did not. It's killed, it's tested, and it is killed. What happened? You're a little awful person. You waited until everybody around you was sick. Then you go, oh God, this must be serious. So you went and got the vaccine after you were exposed. Remember, if you get the vaccine, it takes 2 months to get protection. So you cannot be exposed to it before you get it, or during the 2 months before the antibodies are made. That's why they start giving the vaccine in August for November. So if you wait and get the vaccine late, you have already been exposed. You're in that 2-week prodrome period when you haven't just got it yet. The vaccine's not going to do a thing for you. So remember, you have to get it 60 to 90 days before you ever come in contact with anyone that's got it. And then it has to be the right one. Now,